Greetings. I've got a mic on my... Is this working if I speak through my collar?
Yes.
Better than speaking through... No, never mind. Okay, I'm going to start with a confession. I've lost the ability to sleep. God knows why, some sort of guilty conscience thing. Maybe Rupert's injected it into me. But so if there's anybody here who has a cure for insomnia, I'm ready for it. And if I completely cock up, you'll understand why. Okay, I'm going to try and talk about phone hacking. Phone hacking's such a weird story. It starts from almost nothing, and yet it produces this incredible, destructive chain reaction. So you see the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police resigning, the Commissioner resigning, the Chair of the Press Complaints Commission resigning, Andy Coulson resigning, brackets and going to prison, the Leveson inquiry set up, the News of the World disappears. On and on it goes, 210 people arrested. And the reason for that is that it isn't really a story about phone hacking at all. It's a story about power. And the reach of the story, its destructive reach, precisely reflects the reach of the power of that one particular man, Rupert Murdoch. So to go back to the beginning, the small beginning. The small beginning of the story is really a kneecap. The kneecap is special. It's royal. It belongs to Prince William. And you may know that back in November, December 2005, the origins of this story begin with Prince William going out and doing something royal and vigorous and hurting the kneecap and calling in on his mobile phone to the mobile phone of somebody in his private office and saying, I think I need to see the doctor. Well, we all now know that unknown to them, the royal editor of the News of the World, Clive Goodman, was in the habit of dialing in and listening to the voicemail messages that were left for royal staff. Now, Clive Goodman understood very well that what he was doing was wrong and furthermore criminal. And so when he wrote stories that were based on voicemails that he'd listened to, he messed with the facts a little bit to disguise their origin. So he didn't write a story that said Prince William thinks he might need to see a doctor. He wrote a story that said William went to see the doctor last week. And the thing is, you remember the knee, it's special, it's royal, and it recovered without the need for any medical intervention. Therefore, the story was wrong, and it rang alarm bells in the palace. Why would Goodman say that? And the suspicion clearly pointed towards the voicemail. Now, insofar as this is a story about power, it's probably true that there was only one group of people in this country who might have shown up as victims of this admittedly rather petty crime and still provoked a police inquiry. Anybody else who might have emerged as a victim would have been less powerful and less important than Rupert Murdoch. But here you had the royal family, the one group of people who might provoke the police into taking the crime seriously. And so they investigated. And the key thing here is in the statistics, that at the end of their investigation, they produced a court case. Here is Clive Goodman, the famous one rogue reporter. And here is the one private investigator, Glenn Mulcair, who had been helping him to commit these crimes. And the police told us and the court and the world there's a grand total of 8 victims of this crime. That was it. That was the end of the story. And so it remained for 2 years. And then we started to get involved at The Guardian and started to uncover stories. Now, I want to just take a step back from the theme about power and just explain to you how and why it was that we pursued this story, because you might think that this is some kind of heroic search for the truth by brave people who understand where they're going and have high moral thinking as their motive. It isn't really like that. It actually consists of 2 different things. One is I understand more and more that when I look at people who are professionally dedicated to their work, that what's actually motivating them is something that you might reasonably describe as madness. So among the investigative reporters I know, they're all driven by demons. There's one I know who grew up in a family knowing that there was a secret. Didn't know what it was, but it was there, this thing that nobody was allowed to talk about. And when he was in his late teens, he burrowed into it and discovered that his father was Jewish and his mother was not. He had been born in the late 1940s when it could be physically dangerous to be a Jew in Britain if the Nazis were going to come across or that was going to be recreated. And furthermore, their respective families had not liked them marrying across the religious dividing line. And so they had moved, the 2 of them, to a town where nobody knew them and had kept this thing a secret from all of their neighbors and friends and even from their own children. Now, that guy hates secrets and spent the following 4 or 5 decades uncovering secrets in corporations and government departments and secret intelligence services, causing ruin all over the place in order to act out this demon. Well, with me, it's a thing. I was in a family where we all got hit a lot. Much, much too much. It wouldn't happen now, but we got battered. And I cannot stand people who abuse power. And as I've gone on, the madness has got greater and greater, and I've been attacking people who are more and more powerful until I end up with arguably the most powerful man in the world. And he doesn't understand it's all my mother's fault. Okay. That's only part of the reason why this unfolded. The other part is that because this is a very powerful man with this enormously powerful corporation, he is arguably, I think, the most powerful man in the world. We can try and define it. He's used to his aggression having its way. And from the outset, this caused him a problem because by being aggressive, he kept dragging us into covering the story. So this all began because I was on the radio talking about a book I'd written about truth and falsehood in the press. I had a little ramble about the fact that I knew that there was quite a lot of crime being committed by newspapers. Alongside me was Stuart Kuttner, the managing editor of the News of the World. Actually, when I say alongside me, if you listen to the Today programme, and there are 2 people apparently in a studio arguing, the reality is that because they're frightened that the 2 people may physically start attacking each other, they're in different studios, hundreds of yards apart, but the sound merges. Okay, so Kuttner came over the airlines attacking me, saying that the comments I had made about crime in newspapers were ridiculous, I appeared to live in another planet. That piece of aggression cost them dear because it provoked somebody who was listening, who I'd never heard of, into getting in touch with me and telling me the truth, which was about this systemic crime in the News of the World. And so we did a story, masses of crime, we said, and furthermore, lots of failure by powerful people to do anything about it. And in the normal course of events, I would have said, okay, big story, follow it up for a week or 2, go off to the next exciting adventure. But they rained down aggression upon us. So within the first 3 days after that story being published, first of all, the Murdoch friends at Scotland Yard, in the shape of the Assistant Commissioner John Yates, came out and rubbished the story and told the world that we'd got it all wrong. And then Rebecca Brooks issued a statement accusing us of deliberately misleading the British people. So I couldn't leave the story. The aggression meant I had to stay with it because the credibility of the newspaper was at stake. So we tootled along and did some more stories, didn't make much progress, kept it alive. A couple of months later, I happened to fall in love with really rather a lovely woman who happened to live in Amsterdam. So I went to the editor and I said, I think I should be doing a different kind of story. I think I should leave the phone hacking and go to Brussels. Brussels is full of extremely important stories that come dripping out of the European Commission. Nobody covers them, and furthermore, it's only 90 minutes away from Amsterdam. Every weekend will be a romantic joy. So, being a good editor, he said yes. And at that moment, Murdoch's friends on the Press Complaints Commission published a report accusing us of lying to the British people, exonerating the News of the World, so the whole romance went nowhere and I was stuck with a bloody phone hacking story. You understand what I mean about the motivation? It isn't quite as clear as it might be. Anyway, we work on it for 2 years. You know, we did the Milly Dowler story. Suddenly all the children were dancing on the desk. The head teacher was running down the road. All the teachers disappeared. It was very, very exciting. Now look at what we found. First of all, we found masses of crime. Masses of crime, the News of the World. If you go back to that official version of events, the cops pursuing William's knee, they said 8 victims. We now know that at the time of that original inquiry, when they arrested the private investigator, Glenn Mulcair, they seized all the notes that he'd kept of all the phone hacking over the years. And that paperwork, which they had in their possession when they told us there were 8 victims, actually showed there were 5,500. That's the scale on which they failed to do their job. And when we started running stories, John Yates, the Assistant Commissioner, not only came out a day later and said, Guardian rubbish, he continued to mislead press and public and Parliament repeatedly over the 2 years between that moment and the Milly Dowler story. At one point, he actually came in to see the editor, Alan Rusbridger, who gave him a cheese sandwich with some cucumber in it, and listened while Yates told him that Nick Davies was getting the story wrong and I must be pulled off. Following that, the commissioner himself, Paul Stevenson, he came in and did the same thing. What on earth are these people doing? And the Press Complaints Commission, the same, the regulator, getting in there and obstructing the truth, protecting Murdoch. Now, the interesting thing is, this is the clue. You would think that you might find evidence of people making phone calls and instructing, from the Murdoch company, instructing the police or instructing the Press Complaints Commission, block the Guardian, conceal the truth. There is no such evidence because power doesn't really work that way. And this was one of the things where this story is so fascinating is that you can see power operating in really fine detail. So the way it works is this. It's a bit like a bully in a school playground. If the bully beats up a couple of kids, all the other children in the playground get the message. They don't have to be told what to do. They will take the initiative to try to placate the bully. Now, in Murdoch's case, it's interesting to see where the power comes from. So, first of all, it's about fear. There is, in part, an individual fear, where if you just take, for example, the 650-odd MPs in the House of Commons, in Parliament, they have seen 2 or 3 of their number having their sex lives exposed, as has just happened to Brooks Newman. And that is a humiliating, painful, ghastly experience that will ruin not just your career, but your inner life. Murdoch's newspaper specialised in doing that. He doesn't have to do it to very many MPs before they are all frightened of him. And it's an interesting paradox that on the whole, people out there in the world aren't frightened of Rupert Murdoch, but within the power elite, there is a really, really significant fear of him, and it's partly because of that individual fear. And then in addition, there's an organizational fear that if his newspapers choose to target your political party or your corporation or your trade union or a charity, he can make it impossible for your organization to function by destabilizing you with a succession of aggressive and probably false headlines. So there is this fear there. But there's something else operating in here that creates this kind of passive power, which is what I'm trying to explain, the power of the bully. And that's something terribly significant, and that's suddenly become part of the zeitgeist. Let me just step back from what I'm trying to say. You know I mentioned the book I did before about falsehood and distortion in the media that I was talking about on the radio when Stuart Kuttner had a go. When I was doing that, I did a very simple piece of research, going into a database of stories that had been published by national newspapers over the previous 15 years or so, and compared the frequency with which we used 2 words, both of which begin with C. First, the word crap. Second, the word capitalism. And the first statistical point is that we talk about crap far more than we talk about capitalism. Now, it seems to me that's a little bit like the fish that doesn't know it's in water. Step back again. When I was at university in the late 60s, early 70s, I was studying politics and philosophy with people who were brilliant, who wrote the standard textbooks. And within that community, it was widely accepted that there was the potential for this country to be the stage of a revolution which would overthrow capitalism. It was the biggest argument of the 20th century. It was there in front of us, particularly following on from that counterculture of the late 60s. Serious people believed there might be a revolution. In some extraordinary way, that's been completely ejected from the mainstream. Now, I just want to tell you a couple more things before, as we say, the sands of time run out. First of all, I want to tell you just about the only thing I've ever written that The Guardian wouldn't publish on what you might call political grounds. And this is to do with this theme about capitalism. This was the parable of the 8th day. And the idea is this. God has spent 6 days creating the world. He's rested for the 7th day, and on the morning of the 8th day, God was sitting in his study, feet up on the desk, playing some pretty cool music that he just created and smoking a cigar, when some angels walked in. Now, when you visualize these angels, these are not white sheets and big feathers. These are guys in very expensive dark suits, white satin shirts, red braces, and they absolutely know what they want. They say, God, what about the economy? All very well creating the fish and the fowl and the planet and the seas and all the rest of it. What about the economy? Who owns all the goods? And how do we distribute them? And to who? And according to what regulations? So God put the cigar down and said, look, this is really terribly easy. The commercial wealth, what I call the capital of the planet, will belong collectively to all these human beings who I've created and who will procreate. And they will hold democratic assemblies in which they'll decide how this capital should be used and how it should be distributed. I mean, I've suggested in a few Old Testament notes that it should be done on the basis of the maxim, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And the lead angel said, oh my God, which was appropriate. You're a Marxist. And God said, what else? So the angels didn't like this idea at all. So they tied God's hands behind his back, tied his ankles together, shoved a Bible in his mouth, strapped it in, and hurled him into the infinite darkness of outer space, which is why he's never been heard of again. And then they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take all of the capital, all of the commercial wealth of this society, and put it into the hands of a tiny minority of people. And all the rest of the people can share in it only if they can persuade that rich 1% to hire them. And even in that case, they'll only pay them the bare minimum that they can get away with. Isn't that a great idea? Well, God was silent. He couldn't answer. And so that's what they did. Now, the point is, you would never, ever, if you were designing the world, create capitalism. You just wouldn't say, let's give all the commercial wealth to this tiny minority and let them organize it. And there was a phase when I was growing up when it was so obviously a lunatic way to organize the world that we tried to push back. We created a welfare state, National Health Service, BBC, all sorts of institutions that belong to us, not to the tiny 1%. And then in April 1979, everything started to come unstuck. And this is just so fundamental. It's like the fish that doesn't know it's in water, that you now have a system. Do you remember when we were little, the money that was made in Britain had to stay in Britain? If you wanted to go to France on holiday, you had to take your passport to a bank and say, I'd like to take out 25 quid, and the bank manager would sign it. The first thing that happened when Mrs. Thatcher won her election victory was she lifted the currency controls. Capital could flow around the world. Suddenly you had multinational corporations that could say to governments, if you don't bust the trade unions, keep wages low, get rid of health and safety regulation, and generally make this an environment which we like, we will remove our capital and take it elsewhere. And that pressure is the beginning of Rupert Murdoch's power, far more important than the various kinds of fear. And it's interesting, you remember I said this is the zeitgeist. I heard Beatrice Campbell, the feminist, talking last week about gender inequality. If you look at Naomi Campbell's book about climate change, Owen Jones, my brilliant colleague from The Guardian on the establishment, James Meek on privatization, this funny little book of mine about hacking, it all goes to the same word, neoliberalism, deregulated capitalism. What on earth have we done to our world? And how can we stop it? I don't know. Maybe God does.